Is Taiwan in imminent peril? Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy, the quarterly radio show and podcast. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, former dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Today, we're going to be talking about the risk of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan and what that will mean for the United States and its allies. I've assembled a star-studded panel of experts for today's conversation. From Washington, D.C., I'm pleased to welcome Kevin Nealer, a former State Department diplomat who now heads the Scowcroft Group, which is the prestigious D.C. think tank and consulting firm that was founded by National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft. It's great to have you back on our show, Kevin.
Honored to be here, Dean.
Also joining us from the nation's capital is Dr. Paul Williams, the president of the Nobel Peace Prize nominated Public International Law and Policy Group and a chaired professor at American University. Paul, it's good to have you back on Talking Foreign Policy.
Oh, Michael, it's great to be back for the conversation.
And joining us from the shores of the Atlantic Ocean in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, I'm pleased to welcome retired Navy Captain Greg Noone, who led the Pentagon's International Law Branch and is now the director of Fairmont State College's National Security and Intelligence Program. Greg, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, Michael.
And with me in the Idea Stream studio in Cleveland's Playhouse Square is Milena Sterio, an international law expert who holds the Distinguished University Professorship at Cleveland State University. It's great to have you back on the show, Milena.
As always, it's such a pleasure to be here, Michael.
And sitting next to Milena is Professor Avidan, the former counsel at Human Rights First and now Associate Dean and Director of the Institute for Global Security Law and Policy at Case Western Reserve University. Thanks for joining our panel, Avi.
Happy to be here, Michael.
All right. So it's widely believed that Taiwan is the most likely flashpoint for a China-U.S. armed conflict. In our first segment, we're going to provide some background. Let's start off with a question for Milena Sterio. The question is, can you briefly tell us about the history of the China-Taiwan situation, I guess beginning with the communist takeover of the country?
Sure, Michael. So after the communist Maoist revolution in China in 1949, the nationalist government of China fled to Taiwan, which is a nearby island, and established a separate government there, claiming to be the legitimate government of all of China. Taiwan then continued to keep membership in the United Nations as well as membership in the United Nations Security Council until 1971 on behalf of all of China. And then in 1971, through a UN General Assembly resolution, Taiwan was basically kicked off the Security Council and out of the United Nations, and that seat went to the People's Republic of China, which is the communist Maoist government of China. And so as a result of that, most countries throughout the world recognize the People's Republic of China, the communist government, as the legitimate representative of China. However, many countries engage in bilateral relations with Taiwan and continue to support Taiwan militarily or economically.
Well, that's interesting because China claims Taiwan is just a rebellious province of China, not a separate country. So let me ask Avi Cover this next question. Avi, to what extent does Taiwan fulfill the international legal criteria for being a state? How does the answer to this question inform international perspectives on Taiwan's status and its right not to be attacked by China?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I mean, in many respects, statehood always invites sort of an intersection of issues of law and policy. By at least one measure, Taiwan very much meets the criteria of statehood. Under the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States, often referred to as the declaratory approach, Taiwan satisfies the four key factors. It's got a clear defined territory, a permanent population of some 26 million people, has a government, a democratic elected government, and enters into relations with quite a few states. However, as a more practical matter, and under what sometimes some scholars refer to as the constitutive approach, very few states recognize Taiwan formally as a state. Only about 12 states maintain diplomatic recognition of Taiwan.
And that's mostly because China literally punishes any state that will recognize
That's
them.
right. So there's a significant realpolitik there, right, that is going to influence whether states are going to choose to recognize. And that includes not just small states, but big states like the United States. So Taiwan, consequently, and as Milena just shared, right, is no longer a member of the UN. It's a member of some international organizations, but is effectively not a state, right? About 12 states recognize it. From a legal perspective, the consequences of that, though, are quite severe. It means that Article 2.4, the key provision of the UN Charter that prohibits invasions of the territorial integrity of a state, the political independence of a state, doesn't, it would seem by the terms of the article, apply to Taiwan because it's not a state, and consequently rights of self-defense, collective defense, as enshrined in Article 51, don't apply either.
All right, so now I want to turn to Paul Williams to tell us about U.S. obligations toward Taiwan. So we've heard that the People's Republic assumed China's seat in the UN Security Council back in 1971. And 8 years later, the Carter administration recognized the communist government as the legitimate government of China and ended its treaty relations with Taiwan. But as I understand it, at the time, Congress enacted the U.S.-Taiwan Act of 1979 to continue U.S. relations with Taiwan and to ensure Taiwan's security. So, Paul, my question for you is that binding and enforceable on President-elect Donald Trump? How does this security guarantee compare, for example, to the 1994 Budapest memorandum that supposedly guaranteed Ukraine's security in return for relinquishing its nuclear weapons?
Well, Michael, the short answer is anything binding on President-elect Trump? Triple question mark. The longer answer would be that this is a rare instance where Congress took up the rights and responsibilities of the United States on foreign affairs. And it essentially said, wait, it looks like we're leaving Taiwan, a traditional ally, a deep economic partner, out in the cold. So we're going to pass legislation, which essentially said three things. The most important is that the United States can and should sell defensive weapons and transfer defensive military weapons to Taiwan. It also conferred diplomatic privileges and immunities on various Taiwanese diplomats to essentially operate in the United States in a pseudo-embassy. And it created this ambiguity of whether or not the United States would come to Taiwan's defense. So plenty of language which talks about can't be settled by force, and that there's a need to essentially defend the interests of Taiwan without actually making it a defense pact. Is it enforceable? We'll have to see. I think my guess is that President-elect Trump would make any decisions about committing U.S. military forces to defend Taiwan based upon current strategic and economic interests and less on a 50-year-old piece of legislation from the Senate. And you mentioned briefly Ukraine and the Budapest Memorandum. There's a real lesson to be learned here for Taiwan and for those that are interested in protecting the security of Taiwan. Ukraine had nuclear weapons. And in 1994, the Americans, the French, the British, and the Russians went to Ukraine and said, hey, how about you dismantle your nuclear weapons and sell the uranium to Russia, and we will assure your self-defense. We see how that's worked out. Wow. So the Budapest Memorandum of Ukraine is a real cautionary tale.
I think we're starting to understand why the Taiwanese are so concerned at this point in history. Now, Avi already told us that the UN Charter won't protect Taiwan. Let me turn back to Milena Sterio. In what ways has the One China policy, along with Taiwan's exclusion from the UN since 1971, shaped the development of Taiwan's international legal standing? And how might this exclusion affect Taiwan's capacity to assert its rights on the global stage?
Well, as Avi already mentioned, the fact that Taiwan is not a member of the United Nations has severe implications simply because Taiwan is not able to actually participate in United Nations discussions and cannot cast a vote, for example, in the General Assembly, or cannot influence discussions in the General Assembly. But also another consequence is that Taiwan is not a member of most international organizations. So although this is unrelated to military threats, for example, during the COVID pandemic, Taiwan, which is not a member of the World Health Organization, was not able to directly participate in conversations about COVID-related security measures. And that had a serious impact, negative impact, I would say, on Taiwan. Now, Taiwan does have the ability to participate in some discussions within some international and regional organizations. So, for example, it participates in the so-called Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation under the name of Chinese Taipei. The name is also deliberate because it does not implicate the claim to statehood or the claim that it's somehow the legal representative of China. But I would argue that as a general matter, the fact that Taiwan does not have statehood or doesn't have formal statehood, and the fact that it cannot participate in most international organizations is clearly a negative for Taiwan.
Is Taiwan in the Olympics?
Taiwan actually competed if you look at the Summer Olympics that just took place, Taiwan actually competed as Chinese Taipei, but only because in order to participate in the Olympics, you don't have to be a country, you just have to have an Olympic committee. So there are 200 plus Olympic committees, so participation in the Olympics does not actually involve statehood.
All right, so I understand that Taiwan is pushing the envelope now. It's been pursuing observer status in the World Health Organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization, Interpol, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change under, as you said, the name Chinese Taipei rather than Taiwan. And China is really opposed to Taiwan's participation and is pulling out all of its diplomatic, economic levers to keep that from happening. So let me ask Greg Noone. Greg, what are the risks and legal challenges for countries that support such action in these organizations given China's staunch opposition?
Yeah, and you just said it, diplomatic and economic levers, right? The economic levers are significant. In 2013, China started the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a program around the world for development and investment. So they're building and investing in over 147 countries right now. So it's difficult to kind of bite the hand that feeds you, since a lot of these countries now are in debt to China, literally in debt to China, based on their programs. And then economically, I don't know that there's any country in the world that doesn't receive some type of trade with China, from cheap plastic stuff on the shelf at Walmart to more expensive items. So the economics of it is pretty significant. And then, of course, China being one of the biggest dogs in the neighborhood, the diplomatic pressure is going to be significant as well.
Okay, I feel like we have adequately set the stage. It is time for a short break. When we return, we're going to talk about the importance of Taiwan to the United States. So stay with us. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Michael Scharf, the president of the American branch of the International Law Association and the former dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Today, we're discussing the risk of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Now, if you weren't with us in the first segment, we're joined today from our nation's capital by the head of the Scowcroft Group, Kevin Nealer, and also from D.C. by the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, Dr. Paul Williams. Now from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, we have the former head of the Pentagon's International Law Branch, Greg Noone, and with me here in the IdeaStream studio is Professor Milena Sterio of Cleveland State University College of Law and Professor Avidan Cover, Director of Case Western Reserve University's Institute for Global Security, Law, and Policy. It's a real party on the air today, and we were just talking about China's view of Taiwan. So there's two questions I want to ask about that, and then I want to switch over to discuss the importance of Taiwan to the United States. So let me start with Avi Cover. Avi, China proposes the, quote, one state, two systems approach for Taiwan. That's pretty much how China approached the reintegration of Hong Kong 25 years ago. What can we learn from how this approach has worked out for Hong Kong?
Sure. So let's first understand what this means. Deng Xiaoping introduced this concept of one state, two systems back in 1979, based on a notion of this one unified state of China, but with an eventual unification of the entities envisioned. But for the time being, China would adhere to its communist socialist system, while Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau would enjoy their freer capitalist systems. The Hong Kong experience should be a cautionary one for Taiwan, and no doubt it is, to ever consider agreeing to such an arrangement. Since the British handed over Hong Kong back in 1997 to China, Hong Kong was intended to enjoy this sort of system. But China's enacted a series of national security laws that greatly curtail free expression, political freedoms, including restrictions on voting rights, with China effectively exerting control over all legislation, political representation, criminalizing all sorts of dissent and political expression, all under the guise of national security. So it's hard to imagine that that's going to be an inviting prospect for the Taiwanese.
And I note that Hong Kong has had a lot of protests about each of these developments. So, Kevin Nealer, let me ask, Taiwan, it's got its own polity. What is the Taiwan government's current position on the future of Taiwan's status? Has it changed a lot from the previous regime's view? What about the position of the Taiwan legislature? Could that influence the course of events? Tell us about what's going on in Taiwan.
Well, Michael, it's the beginning of wisdom to appreciate that other countries, other places have politics, so I'm really glad for that framing. I think the Taiwan government says and likely believes it need not declare independence for the simple reason that it's, sit down for this bit, independent, full stop. The DPP government routinely says that repeating that highly provocative assertion is unnecessary. I just talked to my friend Ryan Haas, who was just in Taiwan and met with the leadership there. And I asked him the same question you're asking me, and he said, look, it's likely that the difference between President Lai and his predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen, is that he's trained as a doctor and she was trained as a lawyer. President Tsai had a very skilled and finessed vocabulary for working these exquisitely complicated issues of Taiwan's status, as we're talking about. President Lai is more linear and comes from a harder green, that's the color of the DPP, a harder green perspective where he's more comfortable mixing and matching the terms Republic of China, ROC Taiwan, and Taiwan, whereas President Tsai really stuck very formulaically to the ROC, Republic of China, in her framing, in her inaugural address and other high-profile events. But if you press me and say how much real distance there is, no, there's a high degree of continuity in the DPP government. And you asked about the legislative yuan. Boy, you only need go on YouTube to look at the performative politics that happens in the Taiwan Congress. Most recently, one of the opposition politicians had his leg broken during one of the fights there. But put that aside for a moment. There's a reason it's contentious. The Kuomintang, the now opposition party, in the last election had gained 52 seats of the 113. The DPP, the president's party, got just 51, and there are two other political parties that got two independents. What does that tell you? Well, no one has a majority. So the hard part of governance, which after all, it was this kind of the signature theme for the DPP, they were a party of filling the potholes and taking care of people's needs. So we think about them in terms of the independent spectrum and all of that. But foundationally, they're a good governance party, and that good governance piece of the puzzle is going to be challenging them for them in the near term because of the makeup of the legislative yuan.
All right, so I've learned two things from what you just said. First of all, I had no idea that Taiwan's presidential political party's color is green, and that there can be more green. And secondly, I think you've convinced me that we're on a collision course between China and Taiwan. So I want to start out this segment with a question to all of our panelists. The question is this: why does Taiwan matter, and why should Americans care about its fate? Kevin, you've got the floor.
Oh, Michael. First of all, let me push back a little bit on that presumption that conflict is necessary. I don't think it is, and I'll make a case later, I hope, why it's in no one's interest. Taiwan's important not only for all the reasons of the vibrant economy between our countries, but it's about America's view of security in Asia, and indeed of China's rights and obligations in the region. So we tend to look at Taiwan. It's 28 million people. As Milena described, it's an island kind of frozen in history, but it's a very vibrant democracy, a dynamic and very innovative economy, and one that you can't see the rest of Asia, or you can't understand it fully without giving Taiwan its place in the architecture in North Asia.
All right, Greg, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think Kevin's hit it out of the park. I would just add to that about 63% of the semiconductors made in the world are made in Taiwan. So it would have a significant impact on the global markets.
Wow. Yeah. There are, I guess, 67, about 70% of the world's semiconductors and about 90% of the most advanced microchips, all made in Taiwan. So if China gets a hold of all of that...
They increased by 4% just since you and I were talking.
Yeah. These are the numbers I have in front of me. So what does that mean for us, Greg?
Well, look, I mean, we found out during COVID that everything has a chip in it. And you saw the supply and demand, and that was a blip. Now you're essentially saying that if we give away that entire democracy to China to do what it wants with it, which they will, as they've demonstrated with Hong Kong, it's going to have an impact on the market. And from a national security perspective, we need to consider where those chips are going. We've had these issues with Huawei and with other entrees into our economy, and these are all concerning of all our national security professionals. And then, as Kevin said, I mean, it is our word, our bond. We've been saying for how many decades that we will defend the democracy of Taiwan.
Now, Paul Williams, why does Taiwan matter?
Well, Mike, I think Greg and Kevin have made the case that it matters, but I think the question to be asked is, does it matter enough for Americans to put troops on the line, to basically engage in armed conflict to defend Taiwan from any aggression by China? That's a real difficult question to answer.
All right, Milena, do you have an answer to that question?
I don't know that I have an answer, but what I would offer here is that, if China is learning from Russia's playbook, China could say, look, Russia was able to chip away at Ukrainian territory. It invaded Crimea, it invaded the Donbass region, and the world sat back, including the United States, and didn't do much about it. It is likely that the United States would be unwilling to put boots on the ground if China actually invaded Taiwan. Now, the one advantage that Taiwan has over these other parts of Crimea is that Taiwan is actually an island. And so I do think that it's militarily, logistically much more difficult to actually invade an island. And I don't think that China is about to do that. But it could certainly look at Russia and say, hey, they were able to get away with this. Why don't we just try?
And Avi, your take.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a great answer either, except that I guess I'm putting all my hopes and chips in a notion of deterrence. And so a way in which China can be convinced that military action is not in its interest may be the saving grace or hope.
All right. Now, Kevin, you started to speak about not just the interest that the U.S. has in Taiwan, but the effect of a China expansion into Taiwan, the effect that it might have on U.S. strategic interests throughout East Asia. So let me ask, would it undermine our security relationship with, let's say, Japan, the Philippines, and other countries in the region if we let this happen?
More than undermine, I think, Michael, it would nearly dissolve. Others have hinted at that. I want to repeat Milena's framing distinction. China maintains Taiwan as part of China. U.S. and others say Taiwan's status is undetermined. The coda on that is we did have President Biden not once, not twice, but 4 times say that he's basically ended the notion of strategic ambiguity. We can debate this issue, but the President of the United States said if Taiwan is attacked, the U.S. will respond with force. I would add, too, we tend to discuss this in binary terms. And several years ago, Captain Noone can explain that the Japanese annual defense white paper just included, as a matter of course, that an attack on Taiwan is an attack on Japan. Who saw that coming? Well, we should have, because they appreciate, the Japanese self-defense force appreciates that in order to take Taiwan militarily, China would have to basically dismantle the 7th Fleet, which is based in Japan. So, the Japanese get a vote in all this. And while Taiwan is a security partner, but not a treaty partner, Japan sure is. So I would caution, when we get into the angels on the head of a pin discussion about whether or not the U.S. will defend Taiwan, there's an automaticity to these obligations that if Japanese forces are being killed, we ain't going to be debating that in Congress for a week. The people at PACOM, at the Pacific Command, are going to be making some choices in real time with the White House's approval. I don't want to make it sound like it just happens the snap of fingers. But the alliances do matter, and they trigger certain obligations instantly.
Well, and I want to point out that we're not just talking about rhetoric or wargaming. There's stuff going on in this area that's a little bit scary. So let me turn to Captain Greg Noone. Can you tell us about recent military activities in the Taiwan Strait by both China and the U.S. and its allies?
Yeah, well, less than 6 months ago, back in May, China had a massive military exercise that completely encircled the island, where they practiced amphibious landings, not on Taiwan itself, but land strikes, air defense, anti-submarine ops. They basically had their Army, Navy, Air Force, and Rocket Force fully involved. So there's clearly sending a signal. This was on the heels of the inauguration of Taiwan's latest president. They're clearly sending a signal. The Chinese fleet is now bigger than the U.S. fleet. And what the U.S. strategy involves is relying, as Kevin just said, relying on our allies. When you put all of the allied fleets together, they're bigger than the Chinese fleet. So it's growing. The tension's growing. The armaments are growing. And it's really something we've been talking about for decades. Our war game at the Naval War College before 9/11 was the South China Sea, that was going to provoke the next war. And now we're looking more closely not only at that, but at Taiwan. And you've got a lot of different players in there who are making it their business to be very concerned about it.
And it's not just about placing more ships in the area. Over the past 4 years, I've read that the Biden administration has quietly built up these strategic frameworks in the area. There's the trilateral agreement with Australia and the UK, the other trilateral defense pact with Japan and South Korea, and something called the Quad agreement with Japan, India, and Australia. The United States is the last player in each of those. So the U.S. It's been sending cruise missiles to Japan. It's established a specialized Marine Corps regiment in Okinawa. It's gained access to airfields and military bases in the Philippines, and it's sent attack submarines to Australia. So let me ask Kevin, Tell us about how these alliances and actions are designed to provide security assurances to Taiwan and deter Chinese aggression.
Sure. Michael, I think let me begin by a compare and contrast, and I often do this with students, including ones up at West Point, by asking, what's the fundamental difference between the structural difference between U.S. foreign policy and Chinese foreign policy? And I would submit that the answer is China has no friends, and the U.S. does, by which I mean it doesn't engage in alliances. And that's not an accident. It's a product of deep Chinese foreign policy, of a commitment to its status as a non-aligned nation. But the ones you just ticked off, the Quad, which incidentally started under Trump 1.0, AUKUS, a long-term commitment with Australia and UK to build nuclear submarines. And I'd add to your list NATO's declaration that China is a strategic threat. Now, that may sound a little bit of a reach for our European alliance, but we were reminded as recently as yesterday with a cable-cutting incident in the Baltic involving a Chinese ship putatively under the command of a Russian officer, that China shows up in places that 2 decades ago we just didn't imagine. And from the Chinese point of view, of course, they see this growing security architecture for what it is, which is a direct threat and at least a limit on their military ambitions and their security options in all of Asia.
Well, let me follow up with a question to Milena. So, much like Russia used the expansion of NATO as one of its justifications for invading Ukraine, Milena, do you think there's a risk that China will characterize the U.S. strategic alliances in the region as hostile encirclement designed to constrain China's economic expansion and influence?
Yes, Michael, I do think that that's already happening. So China, the Chinese government, has already issued statements in which it has essentially painted these alliances as a threat to China. You already mentioned some of these alliances, but there's the Quad, as you mentioned, India, Australia, U.S., Japan. There's also the so-called Five Eyes Alliance, which is New Zealand, Australia, the U.S., the U.K., and Canada. And there's also the AUKUS Alliance. And all of these different groups of countries' alliances have already been seen and perceived as China as a threat and as potential justification for additional actions by China. Now, let's hope that China isn't going to use this to actually say this is justification for invading Taiwan. But as I mentioned earlier, to the extent that China is learning from Russia's playbook, remember that Russia used essentially the excuse of NATO and the potential of Ukraine joining NATO as one of its justifications for going after Ukraine. So let's hope that China isn't going to use the fact that the U.S. now has all these alliances as justification for going after Taiwan militarily.
All right. Deterrence or provocation? It's time for another short break, so when we return, we'll be discussing whether a Chinese possible invasion of Taiwan might be inevitable, and, more importantly, how such action might be avoided. Back in a moment. This is Michael Scharf, former dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and we're back with Talking Foreign Policy. I'm joined today by military, diplomatic, and legal experts, and we're talking about the possible consequences of a future war over Taiwan. In this final segment, we're going to be focusing on whether a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is actually inevitable and how the United States would respond, and more importantly, whether there is any way to avoid that scary outcome. So let's start by talking about the sense of urgency originating in Beijing. Kevin Nealer, we hear that Chinese President Xi Jinping expects his military to be able to retake Taiwan by 2027, right before his third term ends. Is that belief based on fact? And is there any military necessity to military action by that due date?
Michael, I'll let Captain Noone discuss this in some detail, but the simple answer is no. There's nothing magic about 2027. It's the product of learning that Xi had from one of his predecessors, Jiang Zemin when there were a series of events in and around Taiwan in the 80s. And then head of government Jiang Zemin said to his, as he sat at the head of the Senior Military Commission, well, we're ready to take Taiwan, aren't we? And there were a lot of embarrassed looks around the table, and the answer was no. That's not an answer you want to be giving to Xi Jinping. And I'd say Xi is very aware of the fact that the military he's inherited was not only not totally unprepared for such a massive and complex undertaking, which would be many times the degree of difficulty of D-Day, but the Ukraine invasion has shuddered through PLA and PLAN and chastened Chinese strategists because their military is in so many ways similar to the Russian one at the start of the Ukraine aggression. Chinese troops haven't fired a shot in anger except for some border skirmishes with India since 1979, and the score back then was Vietnam 2, China 0. So its military hasn't been up with the smoke and the blood as the U.S. military has every day and every night until the Afghan withdrawal for over 2 decades. In addition, what we've seen recently is that senior ranks in the military, including their nuclear force, have been subject to high-level purges and anti-corruption probes that don't seem to be over yet. So there's a real question about how much confidence Xi has in his own military.
So, Kevin, your analysis, I believe, gives us some comfort. But one expert has written that, quote, suspicion, threat inflation, zero-sum framing, and worst-casing are increasingly dominant factors in the U.S.-China interactions over Taiwan, driven by preconceived ideas of the other's intentions based on history and ideology and domestic pressures in each country to prioritize military deterrence and even aggression. So, Kevin, in this context, let me ask you, what actions do you think are most likely to trigger Chinese military force against Taiwan, even if, as you say, it's less likely than we may have believed?
Well, let's be clear, an outright declaration of independence, having said that that's implicit in Taiwan's polity, were that to occur, U.S. recognition of Taiwan as an independent state, and Michael, you've said this, and I think you're right, U.S. abandonment of Ukraine, all would be very equivocal signals, could change the fundamental incentive structure in Beijing. They can't, I've said this many times, but the only thing on which 1.4 billion Chinese agree is that Taiwan is part of China. It's actually quite remarkable how thoroughgoing that view is. But it doesn't mean there's an easy or necessary path for that to happen anytime in the near term.
Now, I know, Kevin, it's difficult to accurately predict what's coming with the new Trump administration, but given that the administration will be starting in January, how likely are any of those events to happen in the next couple of months or years?
It's a great question, Michael. I think what my firm is telling our clients is with Trump, don't do policy analysis, do pattern recognition. And if you look at the first Trump administration and look at the kind of through philosophy that carries over, such as it is, it's a government that has said, and I believe intends to deal with America first, and it's highly allergic to lengthy and costly foreign wars. So the question before us is to what extent they celebrate antipathy and neuralgia towards China by translating that into protective instinct for Taiwan, and how they see Taiwan in the context of our Asian security architecture. Is it a country just taking advantage of the U.S. commercially and in security terms, or do they see the significance that Captain Noone and others mentioned earlier in our conversation?
All right, so back to Captain Greg Noone. Hypothetically, assuming things escalate towards war, Greg, what would a Chinese invasion of Taiwan actually look like?
Well, first, let me give you the good news to dovetail on what Kevin said when we talked about these, preconceived ideas of the other's intentions. We have one of the most capable naval officers of our generation as the Indo-Pac commander in Admiral Sam Paparo, who understands China and recognizes what all of this entails. Now, I have the personal benefit of knowing Sam for 40 years. We were classmates at Villanova, and he is, without a doubt, one of the smartest naval officers we've produced in a generation. So that's the good news. The bad news is in 2015, China's military strategy changed again from their previous military strategy that was issued in '93. And they're going to focus on speed, deception, and coercion. It's not going to be a long, slow process. They're going to look for a swift seizure of Taiwan in order to decrease the potential of foreign intervention, avoid engagement with international forces, and introduce both logistical and diplomatic dilemmas for all the other countries that think they're going to help Taiwan. Taiwan and China are only separated by 97 nautical miles, and what that means is 60 nautical miles is 1 degree of longitude and latitude. And so it's about 1.5 degrees away. It's not that far away. You could undertake a military exercise like they do from time to time, and then with a quick feint, use that as the precursor to operational execution. So, but if China cannot achieve a rapid seizure of Taiwan, it's going to run the risk of a prolonged armed conflict and really put it on direct conflict with the U.S. and their allies.
All right, and we were debating earlier whether the U.S. would actually come to Taiwan's defense. But let's say they do. What would the cost be to the United States?
Well, I was at a conference not too long ago where we were some military professionals medical professionals in the military were talking about the survival rate of casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan and how remarkable it was. And then we turned the page and started talking about China, and they said that we would not have the same success, and the casualty rate would be catastrophic.
Do you think
so
China would resort to nukes?
Nope, just the you're talking about an island in the middle of the ocean, where undertaking operations in Iraq and Afghanistan are fairly straightforward in that respect, and so getting medical assistance to personnel. So it would be significant casualties on both sides. It would be a really bloody conflict, to say the least. So that's what it would look like.
All right.
It would be something that people don't want to see on TV.
So our hypothetical is awful to even contemplate, but Avi, let's take it to the next step. What would the international legal implications of a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan be, and how might countries invoke collective security mechanisms or international treaties to respond to such an event?
Yeah, I think it's going to be challenging from a legal perspective. I think for many of the policy and national security considerations that Kevin and Greg have elucidated, that's really what's going to determine what happens. The Taiwan Relations Act, certainly sets forth a policy, as Kevin alluded to, of really what is strategic ambiguity. Maybe President Biden, walked that back, or he said otherwise more definitively that the U.S. would act. It was then walked back by his advisors. We've seen, again, as the reference to a number of these international pacts, whether it's involving Japan or South Korea or G7 states, but all of those are more political commitments than binding legal agreements, effectively saying that peace and stability matters, and that these states oppose and will act. But we're really relying more on their word than anything else. Whether it's a binding legal obligation is another matter. I know you referred to the RAND Corporation report earlier. I mean, they've assessed that likely just 2 states would aid the U.S., maybe Australia and Japan.
Wow. So let's move our lens to the UN General Assembly. So, Milena, when Russia invaded Ukraine back in 2022 and the Security Council was paralyzed by the Russian veto, the UN General Assembly used this thing called the Uniting for Peace mechanism to circumvent the Security Council and pass resolutions that first declared the invasion to be an unlawful act of aggression, and then they suspended Russia from the Human Rights Council, and then they even created a registry to document damages that Russia would have to someday pay. Do you think the same kind of thing would happen to China in the UN, or are the politics completely different?
So, no, I don't think the same thing would happen to China. And I think there's a big legal difference here. And the big legal difference is that Ukraine is a sovereign, independent country, whereas Taiwan, as we discussed previously on this show, is not necessarily a country. It's certainly sort of state-like. And as Avi mentioned earlier, it might objectively satisfy all four criteria of statehood, but it is not recognized as an independent state by most other countries. And so when you talk about, for example, aggression, well, aggression is an act committed by one state against another state. And so if you say that Taiwan is not officially a state, then there is no legal act of aggression involved. And so I simply don't think that the situation in the General Assembly would be the same as with respect to the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
So legally, it's quite different. Politically, they're very different as well. China has, over the last several years, become this immense economic power that is involved all over the world. When I've traveled, for example, to Africa, I see Chinese work crews all over the place building roads. So let me ask Avi, do you think that diplomatically, it's also a different situation?
Very much so. I mean, China has really ingratiated itself in many ways, but also made itself vital to so many other states. So I think incurring the wrath of China is a dicier proposition than maybe with Russia. But, you have to think of also just other dynamics. I mean, even the dynamics with Russia seem to have changed over time, where there's been sort of a greater, if you will, normalization. But yeah, it's definitely a different proposition.
Yeah, countries get tired of sanctions. It hurts their economy. So I don't want to leave our audience in a state of utter depression. So Paul Williams, you've negotiated over 36 peace agreements as president of the Public International Law and Policy Group. From your experience as a peace negotiator, do you think there is any prospect for a peace agreement, for some kind of unification between Taiwan and China to head off a future military confrontation?
Well, Michael, I think there's a possibility for an agreement or an understanding based upon the three no's, and it would be between the United States, China, and Taiwan. And the three no's are China may be contemplating war with Taiwan. China does not want a war with the United States for the reasons that we've all discussed here today. The no, the United States does not want a war with China. And the third one is Taiwan doesn't want to be merged with China. So ideally, backed by economic mutually assured destruction and not military mutually assured destruction, we might be able to reach a memorandum of understanding or a new updated version of our understanding based upon these three no's.
Kevin, what's your take?
I think Paul has framed it elegantly. And the problem, Michael, as you know well, is that sovereignty isn't divisible. So as long as that's at the core of Taiwan's future, negotiated solution seems elusive. But I will say you need to look at the Chinese incentive structure and what China needs and wants out of security and positioning in Northeast Asia, and ask yourself how it would be served by a kinetic act against Taiwan, remembering that Chinese killing Chinese is a really bad look all over the country. Yeah, everyone thinks Taiwan should be returned to the mainland, but no one wants a Tiananmen-style event that plays out on the world stage. So there are real constraints on the Chinese, and I think we ought to think that the risk point is perhaps less about kinetic action and more what we described as gray zone techniques by China, just boiling the frog and putting a lot of pressure on the internal politics of Taiwan.
That's a good way to end things. Wow, this has been such an eye-opener. It's time to bring our program to a close. I'd like to thank our experts for sharing their expertise on the risk of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, what it would mean for the United States, and what are the possibilities of avoiding that. Kevin Nealer, Greg Noone, Paul Williams, Milena Sterio, and Avi Cover, thank you all for providing your insights about this important and potentially frightening topic. I'm Michael Scharf. You've been listening to Talking Foreign Policy.